I can't believe I'm doing this because I've had more run-ins with the My Hero Academia fan base than I would like to admit, but it's one of the biggest fan bases on Earth, and well, that's kind of how views get dictated on YouTube, so here we go. However, run-ins or not, this show is incredible and the manga is going absolutely insane right now. So yes, I'm going to swallow my pride, and today we are going to be talking about My Hero Academia. But what within My Hero Academia are we talking about today, Nick? Well, that's a great question. Today, we're talking One for All, the titular quirk that belongs to our main character, Izuku Midoriya. This quirk has an incredibly long and storied history. This stockpiling quirk has seen 9 hosts, and the majority of those hosts have added a quirk to this stockpiling quirk for our main character. But who were these previous 9 hosts? How did they get the quirk? What quirks did they add to the stockpile? How did they live? How did they die? And most importantly, how does One for All really work? We're gonna answer all those questions and more in a second here, but please guys, for me, before we get into anything else, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Well, obviously I could sit here and tell you about all the abilities Deku gets in the manga. I feel like it's more important that before we talk about where One for All currently is in the manga, we have to talk about where it began. Most importantly, we have to talk about the first host of One for All, and then go through the catalog of hosts that have added onto One for All throughout the years. Basically what I'm saying is, we're gonna start this video in the way that we usually start these videos. At the beginning. Long ago, at least a couple hundred years ago, considering the fact that we have had 9 hosts of One for All, there were 2 brothers. And these 2 brothers were born with quirks, though one brother's quirk was a lot stronger than the others. See, these 2 brothers were All for One and Yoichi. All for One was born with the ability to take other people's quirks and either give them to himself or other people. A quirk that rises above all other quirks in its ability to either steal, stockpile, or give away. It is absolute control over a society run by quirks. However, All for One's brother did not have nearly as powerful a quirk. In fact, for the majority of Yoichi's life, everybody thought he was born quirkless, but he wasn't. Yoichi was born with what was known as a transference quirk, but that's it. His quirk conferred no powers outside of the fact that he could pass this powerless quirk to someone else. But since his quirk conferred no powers, he never learned that he could pass this quirk on, and even if he did know he could pass this quirk on, it's not like there would be a reason to. That wasn't until his brother All for One decided to force a quirk upon him. You see, this quirk was a stockpiling quirk, much like All for One. This quirk allowed Yoichi to stockpile power within his body. That is to say, he could fill his body with energy and use it for explosive bouts of strength. But it also meant that he, much like his brother All for One, could also receive other people's quirks, but not in the way that All for One does it. But since we're talking about All for One, Yoichi despised him. He despised his totalitarian dictatorship-like views, a man who played God in a quirk-driven society, and therefore Yoichi, driven by his sense of justice, went to fight his brother. However, Yoichi only had one quirk, and that was the stockpiling, a power quirk that his brother had given to him, and therefore he fell very short in terms of the strength acquired to kill All for One. Realizing that he himself wouldn't be able to undo the terror that All for One was inflicting upon the world, he trusted heroes of the future with his quirk. You see, after his defeat, Yoichi had been kept in a prison cell. However, Yoichi was actually broken out of this jail cell by a group of heroes, specifically the second user of One for All. See, we've already covered the fact that Yoichi identified he wouldn't be the one to defeat All for One, and therefore Yoichi decided to pass One for All onto the second user of One for All. See, I say second user because we don't know the second user's name. Now, there's theories about who this second user is, specifically because the second user of One for All looks exactly like Bakugo. He has blonde spiky hair, a large scar on his face, he wears a battle jacket, and gauntlets to fight with. He's also aggressive and kills people without a second thought. And he was the leader of the resistance army fighting against All for One. And in fact, recently in the manga, Deku tried to use his meta ability, and since we're using the terminology meta ability, this is a good time to explain what a meta ability is. See, a meta ability is one of the quirks conferred through All for One. So while technically not a quirk itself, it has its own classification as a meta ability because it falls under the umbrella of One for All. Back to what we were talking about. Deku in the manga recently tried to use this meta ability, and the second user of One for All told him not to use it because it is a last resort. That is to say that the way that this quirk was powered up with the power of One for All might make it so powerful that it kills Deku upon his usage of it. So who is the second user of One for All? Some people say it's Bakugo time traveling, some say it's Bakugo's great-great-great-great-grandfather. And what was their quirk? We just don't know. We'll probably know like really soon though. They're pretty much building up towards it in the manga right now. But I don't do spoilers, so You're welcome. Unfortunately though, Yoichi passing down this quirk to this unnamed second user started a bit of a cycle. You see, All For One realized that the only quirk on Earth that would probably be able to beat him was unfortunately the quirk that he forced upon his brother. All For One, One For All. I'm gonna get those mixed up a bunch. And therefore, All For One started to hunt down users of One For All. And this is exactly what he did to the second user of One For All. And when All For One found these users, he fought them and subsequently killed them. However, all the users of One For All were prepared for this, and therefore they passed down the quirk to others before they were killed themselves. And this is exactly what either Bakugo or Bakugo's great-great-great-granddad did when he passed the quirk down to the third user, whose name we also don't know. However, we do know the third user of One For All's quirk, Fajin. Now, Fajin, for the moment, is a manga-exclusive quirk, so if you don't want any manga spoilers, until we get to the next user. See, Fajin is a very interesting quirk, but really only when it's used in conjunction with One For All. See, Fajin is a bit like Finks' ability from Hunter x Hunter. Essentially, by doing repeated motions, the user of Fajin builds up kinetic energy in their muscles. So let's say, hypothetically, I did a bunch of these arm curls. The kinetic energy built up in my arm from this repeated movement would get stored within my muscles. The user of Fajin can then use that stored energy to increase their speed and power in combat, in fleeing, in getting somewhere. Essentially, it's a bit like cranking up one of those cymbal monkeys. The longer you crank it, the more energy it's gonna have to bang those cymbals together. And that energy can be used for anything. I know what you're saying. You're saying the same thing that I say about Finks.
Well, then why doesn't Deku just crank his arm forever and whenever sees All For One, just...
Well, Fajin doesn't allow you to use all of your stored energy at once. You can only use it in fragments. However, this does allow you to have multiple bursts of speed and power. The reason that I say this quirk is only interesting when it's used in conjunction with One For All is because the power of One For All super boosts this quirk. Imagine repetitive movements based on kinetic energy build up energy that you can use for power and speed in your muscles. Now consider the kinetic energy that one generates in those same movements using One For All. It's a much higher threshold. And currently in the manga, even though Deku can only use One For All at a 45% rate, with the use of Fajin super boosting his muscles, he can use it at almost 100% rate. And this isn't like when he used 100% in his arms and broke all of his bones. Because this is just storing of kinetic energy using a meta ability, there's no backlash to his body. However, even with these quirks being combined, the third user of One For All was also not enough to take on All For One, and thus they died in combat against All For One. Now, the fourth user of One For All is when we finally start to actually know something about these users. And the fourth user of One For All is also probably the most interesting user outside of Deku. See, the fourth user of One For All was Hikage Shinomori, and Hikage Shinomori was the longest wielder of One For All outside of All Might. But why did he wield One For All for so long? And what did wielding it for so long do to him? Well, strictly in terms of appearances, Hikage had a crack running down his face that was caused by the strain of having One For All in his body for so long. But this wasn't the only crack on his body. His entire body was covered in cracks from the overwhelming power of One For All existing within him. But then why isn't Deku covered in cracks? Why isn't All Might covered in cracks? Well, because One For All works a bit differently for those who have quirks and those who don't have quirks when they inherit it. See, those who don't have quirks when they inherit One For All get to live regular lives, outside of the fact that there are these incredibly powerful superheroes that can smash buildings in one punch. However, if you inherit One For All while you have a quirk, it's much like getting a Demon Slayer mark. Essentially, to signal that you're going to die at a young age. And this unfortunately was the case for Hikage. You see, Hikage understood that there was a massive difference in power between himself and All For One, which, like, fair. Therefore, instead of confronting All For One, Hikage decided to put himself in seclusion and train One For All for the next predecessors of the quirk. That is to say, he committed his entire life to making the quirk as strong as possible. Therefore, the person he passed it down to would be stronger and more suited for a battle against All For One. However, Hikage only wielded the quirk for 18 years. But the power of One For All and his quirk Danger Sense tore his body apart. But since we're talking about Hikage, we should talk about Danger Sense, which is also technically only manga canon at the moment. So once again, this quirk works exactly like Spider-Man's Spidey senses. Essentially, this quirk does exactly what it sounds like. It gives the user the ability to sense any potential threats around them and react accordingly. So if somebody was running at me from behind me with a dagger and I didn't see them, I would get a sharp stabbing feeling in the back of my head that wasn't the dagger that would tell me that there was somebody trying to kill me. At least this is how Deku describes the feeling of danger around him, like a sharp stabbing feeling in the back of his head. This quirk also gives the user the ability to pick up malice and negative emotions of humans around them. However, there is some weaknesses to this quirk. While the quirk obviously gives you the ability to ascertain whether somebody's attacking you with malice and therefore whether or not you should take the attack seriously. If somebody attacks faster than Danger Sense can pick up on, then obviously you're not going to pick up on it and you're going to get hit by the attack. But also, if somebody attacks you without malice in their heart, Danger Sense won't pick up on it. Let's say if somebody was like, I'm going to kill you out of love, Danger Sense wouldn't trigger. Therefore, this could lead people with Danger Sense into a false sense of security. Also, the larger the threat that Danger Sense picks up on apparently is very exhausting, as in it can weigh down on your mental and the stabbing pain is almost unbearable, which could have been why Hikage decided to avoid battle with All For One. The Danger Sense that he would have picked up on when he was fighting All For One might have quite literally killed him, but in the end he still died at the age of 40 when he passed on One For All to Daigoro. See, Daigoro Banjo is the 5th user of One For All, and for those of you who are anime only on MHA, he might be the previous inheritor of One For All you know best, outside of maybe All Might or Nana Shimura. See, Daijiro unfortunately did not share the sentiment of Hikage, in that he wanted to come into combat against All For One, and this could be tied into the fact that before he inherited One For All, he was actually a pro hero known as Lariat. See, Lariat or Daigoro had the ability called Black Whip, an ability that ironically also works a lot like Spider-Man's. Essentially, Lariat's ability was reaching out black tendrils of energy from his hands in order to grapple things and increase his mobility, kind of like Spider-Man's webs, but less in a straight line, I guess, because they were more able to operate like octopus arms than anything. He was the exact opposite of his predecessor, being incredibly proud and loud person. However, that pride was not unwarranted. See, because obviously, unlike Hikage, Daigoro wanted to fight All For One. However, when Daigoro came into combat with All For One defeated him and tried to steal the quirk from him. However, Daigoro's incredible will and the fact that the user of One For All has to willingly pass it on to somebody else stopped All For One from being able to steal it. And in fact, while they were fighting, Daigoro actually gave some of his blood that was shed in the fight against All For One to his next predecessor, N. Essentially, Daigoro, understanding that he wasn't going to beat All For One, passed his blood on to his subordinate or his sidekick in N. And thus, in the passing of this quirk and the fact that he had gotten pretty roughed up by All For One, died. And we were given our 6th user of One For All. But here's the thing. N was the polar opposite of Lariat. While also a pro hero and technically a subordinate to Lariat, N was an incredibly quiet and bashful person, unlike his very loud and boisterous predecessor. And once again, unlike his predecessor, N's quirk was largely defensive. See, N was born with the quirk Smokescreen, which is exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, N was able to create smoke off of his body that could be used to make a smokescreen. And obviously with the power of One For All, he could make like a bunch more smoke and also move very quickly within said smoke, which with tactical thinking is actually a very powerful ability. Essentially being able to obscure the vision of your opponents and move very quickly within it, and then attack where your opponents least expect it. However, N was very humble and he understood that his quirk was by far not the strongest, which is why he's actually come to Deku through the planes of One For All to tell him how to use the quirk correctly, fully maximizing the ability of a not so strong quirk. However, unfortunately, awareness of the fact that his quirk was weak wouldn't stop him from engaging All For One in combat, and N went out much like his predecessor, Lariat. However, one similarity he shared with Lariat is that in his battle against All For One tried to pull once again One For All out of N, and N resisted it with insurmountable willpower. And after being fatally wounded in this fight against All For One, he gave some of his hair to our 7th user of One For All, Nana Shimura. You see, Nana Shimura is my favorite user of One For All, but her history is complicated and a bit messy. See, Nana was an incredibly commanding presence who was happy and smiling all of the time. But outside of being a superhero, she was also a mother to a man named Kotaru, who got married and had some kids of his own. One of those kids was named Tenko Shimura. However, Tenko was born with a terrifying ability, a quirk called Decay. And one horrific night when he awoke to his quirk, he accidentally killed his entire family, Nana Shimura's son Kotaro included. Obviously, Tenko was then adopted by All For One and given the name Tomura Shigaraki, and therefore one of the strongest and most passionate users of One For All ever, and one of All For One's strongest opponents was the grandmother of the person All For One would turn into his subordinate one day. But was Nana the best mom that she could be? Well, No, not really. See, Nana felt as though she was forced to place Kotaro into foster care because of the dangers that her job brought her children. That is to say that she wanted to separate herself entirely from her child in order to make sure that her child would never get brought into the crossfire of hero and villain work. And while she thought this was a well-intentioned good thing to do, Kotaro, her son, felt exactly the opposite, growing hate for her and heroes as a whole. But when Nana cuts all ties with her son, she cries, which is very weird for her as a character because her entire personality is based around always maintaining a smile. She believed by always smiling while doing hero work, she brought comfort to those she was saving. This is why Toshinori, also known as All Might, always smiles while doing hero work. Outside of her personality, Nana had a quirk outside of One for All, and that quirk was called Float, where, and you're not gonna believe this, she could levitate herself into midair. However, we don't know if she could fly. We just know she could float, which is like cool and all. I guess if you ever fall off a building, you don't have to worry about, fall damage. Or if you got somebody with a wind quirk that can push you really far. But if that's like your whole thing, it's not great. I mean, obviously it works for Deku because he has things like Fajin and Black Whip, but for Nana, it wasn't super powerful, which is why unfortunately when she came into combat against All for One, she died. However, Nana, seeing the trend of One for All users coming into combat against All for One, and then in a panic having to give their DNA to their subordinates, decided to give Toshinori, also known as All Might, One for All before her battle. And their battle was legendary, however Nana was killed, and thus Toshinori became the 8th inheritor of One for All. However, there was a couple of things about All Might that made him unique and more powerful than any of his predecessors. He was born quirkless. See, while at first Nana Shimura laughed that Toshinori thought he would become the face of justice even though he was born quirkless, as she got to know him, she realized that he could absolutely do it. And because All Might was born quirkless, the strain of One for All didn't kill him at a young age. In fact, All Might was able to wield One for All for 40 years, double the time of Hikage. And this is actually a theory that All Might had. He was looking into the deaths of every user of One for All, and he realized that by being born quirkless, he got to have it for longer, and thus he got to train it for longer than anybody else and get used to its power and use it at 100% capacity, all because he was an empty vessel for One for All to fill. See, there's a common misconception about All Might that he was born with a quirk, and that's because of the way that he uses One for All so proficiently at a young age. See, Toshinori, while not born with a quirk, was born with an incredibly resilient body. I don't know, maybe he drank his milk. However, because Toshinori was born with such a powerful and resilient body, he could use One for All at 100% rate much faster than anybody else could ever. And because his body was so powerful and well trained, there'd be very little blowback when he used this high level of One for All. And because he was able to come into the power of One for All so quickly and at such a high rate, he became known as the strongest hero in history. He became known as the undefeated hero, a man capable of fighting crime for 3 days straight with no rest. Anything that happened within his city could be resolved by him in mere seconds. But more than any of that, he was the first wielder of One for All to come into combat against All for One and win. 6 out of 7 previous wielders of One for All had gone into combat against All for One, and every single one of them had died. But All Might was not only able to defeat All for One, but also to basically cripple him. See, most people understand that All Might took a crippling amount of damage in his fight against All for One, and thus after that fight, he was significantly weakened, being unable to hold his All Might puffed up form for much longer than a couple of minutes. However, in this fight, All Might also significantly weakened All for One, which is why All for One is looking for people like Shigaraki to take his place, or just do his dirty work, you know what I mean. However, since after taking this grievous injury, All Might was only able to hold his hero transformation for 3 hours a day, which is why he decided to become a teacher at UA, where he was scouting out potential inheritors for his quirk. However, the problem with being a teacher at UA is that all of the students and therefore all of the candidates for receiving One for All had quirks, and All Might was beginning to understand that the true strength of One for All lies in a quirkless host. And by using the evidence of Hikage's early death and the crack marks on his body, he understood that the power of a quirk and All for One in one body was too much, which is why when he found Izuku Midoriya, who embodied the idea of the face of justice and looked up to him, he gave him a strand of his hair to pass One for All to him. Toshinori and Izuku had a weird relationship as far as One for All inheritors go, because every previous inheritor of One for All, upon inheriting One for All, basically lost the person who had it before them. But Izuku and All Might got to exist simultaneously as inheritors of One for All, which left us with a lot of questions about One for All and how it functions. And it made us ask the question, could two people have One for All? simultaneously? Or does the actual act of passing it down to somebody else begin to dampen the flame within you? The flame of One For All, that is. Well, basically what we've learned by Deku awakening to all of these meta abilities and previous users of One For All kind of answers that question for us. See, when All Might passes One For All down to Deku, he says that he's only clinging onto the embers of One For All, which makes it feel as though the quirk is actually being transferred to Deku. And the stronger that it gets in Deku, the weaker it gets in All Might. But was that just because All Might was getting weaker because of his injuries? And what was stopping All Might from giving One For All to multiple people? To answer that question, we kind of have to look at One For All as a sort of possession. See, we know within One For All lays the spirits of every previous user. Now, obviously, these spirits didn't manifest as meta abilities in previous users, and that's what makes Deku unique. But the fact that your soul gets stockpiled because of this quirk into One For All kind of points us in the direction that only one person should be able to use this quirk at a time. And this is further evidenced by the MHA movie Heroes Rising, 9 being the bad guy in Heroes Rising. So like by and large, the community does believe that this movie is canon. However, in this movie, both Deku and Bakugo have One For All simultaneously. However, at the end of the movie, One For All leaves Bakugo because One For All wants to stay with Deku, showing us that two people can simultaneously briefly have One For All, but One For All wants to stick with one person. And that one person in this circumstance happens to be Deku, our 9th inheritor. Now, I'm not going to do an entire deep dive into Deku as a character because that's a whole video on its own, but Deku obviously inherited One For All from All Might as a quirkless nobody, and because he was quirkless, he can use One For All at the highest level of power. Well, sort of. You see, Deku in the manga still isn't able to use 100% of One For All. He can use 45%. However, like I stated earlier, he can use some of the meta abilities given to him by previous users of One For All to boost those numbers up. At least pseudo boost those numbers up, because he could still hypothetically one day achieve 100% of One For All, which means that with the combination of 100% of One For All, Fajin, Black Whip, and Float, and all those other things, he would be significantly stronger than All Might ever was. Now, Deku uses All For One in the same way that everybody has used All For One prior to him, except his use of All For One is largely influenced by All Might, which is why he uses things like Delaware Smash, or Manchester Smash, or Detroit Smash. However, where Deku differs from All Might is the fact that he uses things like Full Cowling, where Deku spreads the power of All For One all throughout his entire body at a lower percentage than 100. Unless, of course, he has area on his back, in which case he can actually use it at 100%. And by using Full Cowl, and thus using the stockpile of power all across the entirety of his body, he gets to boost his speed, durability, and power substantially. And then, obviously, he has the rest of his meta abilities: Fajin, Danger Sense, Smokescreen, Black Whip, and Float. And therefore, he has the arsenal of every previous user of One For All. However, he has their quirks at the hyper boosted level that One For All provides. And he will have it for a long time, because just like his predecessor, All Might, he is quirkless, and therefore he will be able to embody One For All for basically his entire life. So Deku's hero work is far from over. And that is basically everything we know about One For All, guys. Did I miss anything? Tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I'm not saying this is a trial run, and if the MHA comments get way out of pocket, this will be the last MHA video I ever post on this page, but be on your best behavior.